So, content warning for people who may have experienced negative things in the past. Discussions in relation to sexual abuse, specifically from men's perspective, coming up. So, I'm not going to go into depth on anything, of course, not. No descriptions, nothing of that sort, but just discussing the topic in a broad sense from a sociological perspective is what's going to be coming up. So yeah, just wanted to let you all know so that nothing is jumped on you. In discussions of sexual abuse, men as a demographic are often left out in a lot of different ways. Now, it is true that disproportionately it is women that are most often the victims of sexual abuse. The amount and the proportion of disproportional discussions and representation of discussions of men being the victims of sexual abuse is very, very, very low. There is practically none of it as compared to, the discussions of women being the victims of sexual abuse when you put into context to what the numbers actually look like on how often these different genders end up getting abused in these senses. So the point of this video here is to talk about some of the reasons why that might be. Why society often doesn't take sexual abuse where men are the victims as seriously as when women are the victims. Now, this is not to say that society takes the sexual assault or sexual abuse of women seriously enough, because it doesn't. It doesn't take either quite seriously enough for us to be happy with the way society treats this, but just the discussions of men's abuse when it comes to, crimes of a sexual nature is completely unheard of as a whole. So that's an important caveat to add there. Why is there this idea or this social phenomena of men's issues not being talked about? And where does it stem from? Well, I've detailed a number of different reasons here, and let's talk about them. So reason number one, there is a perception that men always want sex. And this and a lot of the other reasons we're going to talk about fundamentally stem from gender roles and expectations that we have of individuals in society. So, for instance, when it comes to the expectation or the stereotype, really, that men always want to have sex, these stems from a sort of gendered evaluation of men on the basis of how sexually successful they are in, a sexual marketplace, should we believe that one such exists. So we can see this, for instance, when it comes to the disparate treatment that men and women receive upon being, or having it divulged that they have been with a lot of people. When men typically do it, what will they get? On average, they will get pats on the back and congratulations. When women do it, in a lot of situations, they will get shamed for it. And this sort of implies, implicitly, that's what implies means. This implies that men are always and should be expected to want to have sex because it's something that we societally sort of praise them for, or that we value them for. And obviously, if this is a perspective that is commonly held upon large portions of the population, it becomes harder to conceptualize an occurrence in which a man does not want to have a sexual encounter, but they are forced to have one. So that's point number one. Point number two is that physiological responses or differences in physiological stature are, have a part to play in how these interactions are evaluated. So there's two aspects of this. First is the physiological stature. So it is often said that how can men be sexually abused, especially by women, if we're talking about women's abuse to men, as opposed to men's abuse of men, for instance. Men are just typically so much bigger. So how could they ever do something? How could a woman ever force a man to do something that they don't want to do? This sort of sentiment betrays a complete misunderstanding of the driving factors behind sexual abuse in victims. It's not a game about who's stronger or not, although it can most certainly have a modifying effect on the engagement. But in addition to that, there are also a number of psychological and societal and cultural pressures that also weigh into a victim's ability to be able to fight back or push back against the victim or against the perpetrator in a significant way. So just because, you know, a victim may be like physically bigger or stronger than a perpetrator doesn't mean that it was impossible for there ever to be some misconduct there on the side of the smaller person, because there is, like I said, a lot of psychological and cultural elements that play into that as well, that have important factors to play in these types of engagement. Number two, there is the part of the physiological responses. So typically when, you know, men are aroused, there is a lot more, it's easier to tell more directly whether or not that is, you know, taking place. And oftentimes it has been cited that, hey, the natural physiological responses of a man has been cited as proof that it wasn't really abuse, that they really wanted it. And this is by no means true or an accurate representation of anything. Normal physiological responses to outside stimuli has no bearing on the mental state of consent on the party or on the victim in this specific instance. They're completely divorced from one another. Just because someone may be physiologically, you know, turned on or whatever, does by no means implies consent or means that it is an engagement that they're willing to have. And that's point number two then. Point number three has more to do with the treatment of male victims in society. Men who are victims of sexual abuse, and often other types of abuse as well that stem from, you know, stuff of the physical nature, even though there is most certainly a psychological aspect to a lot of these cases of abuse as well, are typically framed as weak and pathetic in society. So because there aren't a lot of like specific cases of this being talked about a lot in the media, it's hard to pull from that. But even if you go to just like a physical thing, like you being beat up or you losing a fight, you know, the losing or the victim part in that is framed as like submissive or weak or pathetic. And actually, if we talk about the instance and the case of, you know, Terry Crews and him opening up about his sexual abuse that he endured, he was ridiculed in media. There were a lot of people that were, number one, just not believing in the things he was saying, but number two, making fun of him, even if they did believe him, for having been able to be the victim of such a thing, right? He's a big, strong guy. Like, how, like, he must be a really pathetic person to have that happen to them. That's the attitude of a lot of these individuals. And just having that response as a victim of, you know, sexual abuse and seeing other men be treated that way when they're the victims has a massive negative effect on, you know, just generally society treating this seriously, or men wanting to open up about their abuse in these instances. So that's another important one. The way that society treats victims has an important part to play in how seriously society takes the issue as a whole, as well as reflective of it. Then there are a number of really troubling patterns in media, especially when it comes to comedy. One of the best examples that you can pull from this is the drop the soap joke, right? Don't drop the soap. When, even if you think about it for just like 10 seconds, okay, what is the joke? The joke is literally that the person who did this is going to get sexually abused. That's the joke. That's the part that's supposed to be funny. And this is like a trend that is common. It's a joke that is even used in children's show and cartoons as well. That's how common and pervasive like this media trope is. And this most certainly feeds into, you know, like a broader disacceptance of like men's abuse and men's issues when it comes to abuse of like the sexual nature. And it's really, really problematic. And obviously it's a joke made predominantly about men in men's prison. So we can also dissect this even further and see, okay, so what are some of the reasons why this might be perceived as a joke or this might be perceived as funny? Reason number one, and this is also rooted in homophobia to a large extent, especially when it's man-on-man violence, is that it implies homosexuality in some form. And we're supposed to find this funny. The subversive element of it is that, oh, it is a man now that is in a submissive position, you know, to another man. And if you tie that back to like gender roles, that's not how it's supposed to be, right? And just general attitudes of people just finding like homosexuality as a thing to be negative or a joke or whatever. Look at, for instance, the way people just use like gay as an insult, for instance, is a pretty strong example of this. And the way people make fun of just like gay people as a whole. And that's often like the butt of jokes, especially in straight communities, that like, oh, what are you, gay? You know, haha, you know, like that type of thing. So that's one sort of reason, if we dissect why people find that like the drop the soap funny or why it's prevalent, it's rooted in homophobia in that regard, which is not great. Number two, this is often put in context of prisons, especially when it's in media and especially in regards to the drop the soap thing, right? And in the minds of an audience, in a lot of instances, people see this as more like, you know, like as a form of schadenfreude, or like they deserved it in a stronger sense. It's they got what was coming to them, right? Because, hey, they're in prison, they obviously did some bad things, so, you know, who really cares what happens at this point? Why we can make jokes at their expense if they are in prison, if they are in the bad situation, if they've done something bad enough for this to be the case. And this is a 100% terrible notion. Just because you're a criminal, no matter what you've done, doesn't mean that you are deserving of sexual abuse and that you're deserving of being sexually assaulted or raped. In no circumstance is that the case. And often, if you put it bluntly and you explain that aspect, instead of just sort of being a layer back and being like, oh, you know, he's a criminal, like they did something bad or whatever, and not really going into that, okay, so let's talk about this, let's open this up and really talk about it in a more like, you know, in a more even playing field, I suppose, you will see more people recognize the issues with it. The general media trope of this drop the soap thing, those are the sort of key elements in what it's rooted in, and a number of other negative social attitudes that it feeds into and that it plays off of for that to be seen as funny. In addition to that, there is another aspect of it in relation to how men treat, or how men are treated, especially depicted as responding to issues of sexual abuse. When it is characterized in media and when it is depicted in media, you often see the victim in the case shrugging it off and moving on fairly quickly from the event. There doesn't seem to be any lasting trauma being depicted from men being exposed to sexual abuse in media, as opposed to women being, exposed to sexual abuse in media. Because of this, you don't take men's abuse as seriously as women's abuse, right? Because there doesn't seem to be as much of a lasting trauma for men as there is for women, at least according to the depictions of media, which is, of course, not the truth when it comes to real life. The effects of trauma is pretty much equal for both groups when it comes to that, the way they deal with things. And in a lot of ways, might be worse for men in regards to the fact that, hey, even though the treatment of both victims is shitty, both men victims and women victims, it's still the treatment of men's victims is absolutely abhorrent, in the sense that it's not even something that most people can conceptualize, the existence of men being the victims in this specific case. So that's another, issue behind this. And then there's like the overarching point of just this being viewed through a patriarchy, right? A lot of people have an incredibly basic one-dimensional view of the patriarchy, where they just see it as women disprivileged, men privileged, pop, end of story. And it becomes difficult for people to see men being victims in any capacity. It becomes harder for that to be the case. And because of a very one-dimensional or more one-dimensional perspective on, the effects of the patriarchy, on gender roles, on the treatment that different people can receive, it leads to disparate treatments of the victims of these specific activities when they're being carried out towards different people from different gender groups. The very gendered perspective of sexual abuse that we have right now, in which men are seen as the perpetrator and women are seen as the victims, can also be exhibited not only in the cultural and social things that I've talked about and I'm going to talk about, but also in laws. So we can see that in a number of places, rape and sexual assault is defined as the abuse of a woman at the hands of a man. This was the case even in progressive places like Europe, for instance, in Scandinavian countries, as of, like a few years ago. So that's another instance in which, hey, these cultural attitudes can be manifested in a legal capacity. And that can be demonstrative and reflective of our general societal attitudes on issues relating to sexual abuse. And obviously, I don't have to explain what the issues are with the definition of certain types of sexual abuse being limited to the perpetrator being of one gender, the victim being of another gender. It becomes very difficult, and it disincentivizes it, and in some cases it might even be impossible to prosecute cases of legitimate sexual abuse in the situation in which the roles aren't as clearly as they are defined in very bad, regressive, and reactionary writings of the definition of sexual abuse laws. So yeah, this has been a bit of like an analysis into some of the reasons behind why men may not receive as much attention and may not receive proper reconciliation and assistance and help following their instances of sexual abuse, and why it's just generally not even talked about in media circles or in political circles as a whole. And this is something that absolutely needs to change. We need to understand that sexual abuse and sexual misconduct is not something perpetrated by men onto women. It is something that any gender can, be the victim of, and any gender can be the perpetrator of. And if we sort of reframe our understanding of these issues from a highly gendered one to a more generalized one, we can make sure that we have better outcomes in how victims of this type of negative behavior are treated. Because there are lots of men who are victims of sexual abuse who may not even recognize it as abuse because they've just internalized so many of these harmful attitudes in regards to what sexual abuse is. There might be men who do recognize it, who are afraid of speaking up about it because they know that the majority of the people, just like with women in a lot of instances, aren't going to believe it or may even ridicule you for it. And then there is also the fact that there is practically no representation in media of these things being the case and of these types of occurrences being common or being prevalent in any capacity at all. Right now, media very much has a one-dimensional perspective on the topic of sexual abuse in society, when really it should be a more educated, nuanced, intersectional, broad understanding of it, which is more reflective of reality and that has better outcomes for all victims in these situations.